Okay, Richard, how is the process of adjudication happening during this time? How are they acting? How the parties acting?
It is challenging. The first thing to see is most of the adjudications are going on for much, much longer. All the submissions are now by email only, and that obviously creates quite a problem when you may have a large amount of appendices. Equally, in obtaining witness statements and expert witness reports is also affecting the ability of the parties to make submissions. The other thing is it seems to me that there are more submissions from the parties. I'm quite often getting up to rejoinder, surrejoinder, rebutter, and then further submissions. I'm also finding lots of challenges to jurisdiction. So it is more difficult in dealing with adjudication during this difficult time, in that papers are all being issued by email, but ultimately things are proceeding much as per usual.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Another question that's just come in, Michael. This is one for you. Someone saying that they did their deal or started their deal in February. It seems to be on ice. So what can they do during this period to ensure that when things get back to, I use the word normal, what can they do to ensure a quick resolution when the situation eases?
Hello, everyone. Julie, I've got a number of clients who are in this position, that they agreed deals for more space in very early March. We noticed that particularly the occupier market really started taking off after Christmas. January was probably one of the busiest Januaries I can remember, the so-called Boris bounce, and it's all now bounced to the ground rather dramatically and rapidly. However, those clients who have negotiated what they think are very good deals, and just for instance of what's on my desk at the moment, I spoke to the landlords. I'm acting for potential occupier on Monday, and we both agreed that we would get all the documentation dealt with and approved and ready for signature. And then as soon as the Coronavirus Act regulations are lifted, we would then proceed to an exchange. The reason that we can't exchange before then is that there are various dates, because there's a massive £1 million fit out to take place before we complete the lease. So the client won't lose the deal. The landlords agreed to defer the rent-free period, which was supposed to have been from 14 days after I received the draft papers. And generally, if you speak to people, most other lawyers I have found in the last week or two have been very amenable. I've got a landlord client who, the week that we all moved working from home, had 2 lettings and a lease renewal. He has basically said, do whatever I think best. So I sent out one set of papers yesterday, another set going today, and I've told the lawyers, let's get everything into place, and then once the rate is lifted, hopefully we can proceed. A lot of clients seem to think that the market is starting to rise in Jan and Feb, and some of them think it's going to crash down, begin with, in sort of a V shape. And they don't want to lose the good deals that they've got, particularly if they've got an amenable landlord. The only delay that I can foresee is that most local authorities have now shut down their search facilities. So I can foresee there's going to be a rush of applications for searches as soon as everything is open, and we get back to what everybody keeps referring to as the new normality.
The new normal, that would be interesting. Okay, we've had a couple of questions along these lines, but on obviously commercial buildings, I can't pay my rent, or I'm struggling or will struggle to pay the rent. What help is available?
There's a lot of help available, but the first thing that I would tell any client is pick up the phone to the landlord or the landlord's agent, because we're all in the same boat. What landlords don't like is clients who are clearly being evasive, quarter day was last week, 25th of March. The rent is now certainly 7 days due. Most leases have got a 14-day provision. And landlords generally, I mean, I was talking with a client yesterday, and he said within reason they are being amenable to anything sensible that's been proposed. Some of the proposals I was just chatting through with him. Quarterly rent can be paid monthly. Rent could be paid in arrears rather than advance. They'll give a rent-free period. They will reduce the rent. They will draw down from their rent deposit, providing that the deposit is topped up later. The one thing that people need to remember is the rent will still have to be paid. I don't think there will be any landlord who say will forego the rent. The plus side of this is that worst case scenario, the landlord has got either proceedings for possession in the court pipeline or is about to take them and wants to seek an order for possession proceedings. From the 27th of March, all possession proceedings are stayed for 90 days under the Act, and we're all still in lockdown. It's likely that period will be extended. I was talking with a client yesterday who's got a lot of retail in secondary locations, and he was telling me there is a little known regulation came in with not much publicity last week in relation to retail, hospitality or leisure. If your property's got a rateable value between £15,000 and £51,000, then you are entitled to a grant. That's provided you're based in England, you're in the hospitality and or leisure. Retail, it's got to be used as a shop, restaurant, cafe, drinking establishment. It also includes cinema and music venues and sort of assembly and leisure centres, hotels, guest and boarding premises, self-catering, Airbnb. If the rateable value is between those figures, there will be a grant of £25,000. Now, to access it, it's very simple. You need to do nothing because the local authority will contact you if you're eligible for this and you come within those parameters. My advice would be, if you haven't checked the local authority in a couple of weeks because they're deluged with all their new powers, is to contact them. And most people probably know now that there is a rates holiday for the retail, hospitality and leisure. And again, do nothing because rates bills, they're all coming out this week, should show no demand. And again, if you do get a big rates bill, don't put it under the table, just ring up the local authority. Those people who were there, I'm told, have been very helpful.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you for that, Michael. I'm sure if anyone's got any specific inquiries, they can contact you directly. Everyone's contact details are on our website, and I will send a link around with individual emails in case anyone wants to get in touch. Ryland, I've got one here for you. The effect of coronavirus on delays under both JCT and NEC. Is force majeure in play for JCT and I think it's compensation events for NEC? Oh, sorry, Ryland, hold on. I've got you muted for some bizarre reason. My apologies. Right, you're back in the room.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So in relation to coronavirus and JCT contracts, first of all, it's important to start with the law. Now, the concept of force majeure is, in fact, a French concept, and there is no doctrine of force majeure under English law. There is, however, often the term is often used in your contracts. Now, the JCT does use the phrase force majeure. It is a provision within the relevant events section of the JCT contracts. Now, the problem is that in order for it to have effect, it needs a definition. So if your contract is not a standard contract and it has a definition of force majeure which may exclude the impact of such things as disease or viruses, which are beyond our control, then you would not be able to rely upon it. The JCT, however, do not include a standard definition, and therefore they really leave it open to the parties to explore whether or not this will be covered. But ultimately, this is going to be something that will undoubtedly become before the English courts to decide upon. It's my view that the circumstances that we're facing do constitute a force majeure. They're circumstances beyond the control of the parties. The key is most likely to be whether or not it's foreseeable. And for that reason, if you've entered into contracts prior to probably the end of January this year, when Wuhan was locked down in China because of a result of the virus, ultimately, if it was before that you entered your contracts, then it's not seen as a foreseeable event. If you entered into contracts after that point, then it is arguable that it was a foreseeable event and therefore would not be covered. So going back to the JCT provisions themselves, there is a relevant event for force majeure. Now that would mean that a party could claim an extension of time and therefore seek relief from damages in relation to liquidated damages if there were a delay to the completion date as a result. There is not, however, an equivalent provision in relation to relevant matters under the JCT contracts. Now, the JCT separates the concept of time and money, and therefore, on the face of it, one would not be able to claim for loss and expense as a result of a pure force majeure event. Now, that's not necessarily the end of the story. And what I've seen over the last couple of weeks in particular is a game of chicken between employers and contractors, whereby employers and main contractors with subcontractors have avoided taking the decision to close sites, putting the onus back on the contractors and the subcontractors, saying, well, here are the regulations, do what you feel is appropriate. And the reason, of course, for doing that is to not trigger an entitlement to make a claim in that regard. If, however, a site owner, main contractor or an employer has taken the decision to actively close the site or given instructions to stop or not to start work, then that moves the entitlement across the line in terms of the JCT contracts, at least. Under the JCT relevant matters, you do have instructions that could give rise to loss and expense, variations, arguably changes to the conditions of the work as a result of these new requirements and restrictions could be something that gives rise to loss and expense. And of course, a failure to give access as well. Now, it's worth mentioning also by comparison the NEC contracts. Under the NEC contracts, you have provisions for compensation events, which will include, if the provision is included in your contract, the last of which, 60.119, are circumstances beyond both parties' control. That's an equivalent force majeure provision. And therefore, under the NEC contract, there is an argument to say you're entitled to claim time and money, which is where it differs from the JCT and the distinction that's made in the JCT contract. There may be other provisions that are relevant. For example, a change in the law under the JCT contract post-base date. If that impacts upon the work, then equally there may be grounds for a claim. And also in relation to the NEC contract, the equivalent provision would be secondary option X2, which also deals with changes in the law. Now, changes in the law can't just be things that Boris Johnson has told us, or indeed any of his advisors. The government can't act unilaterally to change the law. Laws have to be enacted by Parliament, go through the House of Lords, and then be signed off by the Queen and given royal assent. And there's a key piece of legislation which was given the royal assent last week, which is the Coronavirus Act. Under that act, there can be instructions, for example, to close businesses and or premises. and therefore that would constitute a change in law if instructions were given thereunder. So this is a rapidly changing environment, but as it stands, ultimately the JCT does make a very clear distinction between time and money, whereas the NEC does not.
Okay, thanks, Ryland. Another one that possibly for you, Richard, may also want to be involved in this one. How do you think these claims will be viewed by adjudicators?
Shall I take that from a party representative perspective, and then maybe Richard might want to add something from an adjudicator's point of view? As a party representative, adjudication can be very much hit and miss, can be a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the decisions that are made. And Richard, no offense there at all, you being an adjudicator, but it's a very rough and ready process, and it's described as rough justice. But what often happens as a result of that is that sympathetic, emotional arguments sometimes get more traction. And you can see if an adjudicator is looking at a situation where a party has been prevented access to an extent, people are isolating as a result of these regulations and the fear that's been created by this virus, then you can see that there would be a sympathy vote, certainly for the parties that have been affected by the circumstances. And on that basis, I think it's more likely that arguments surrounding force majeure will, in the first instance at least, before an adjudicator, be seen more favourably and are more likely to succeed in respect of extensions of time. Also, it would obviously seem unfair on very general basis to penalise someone for completing late where clearly events beyond their control have caused that delay.
Yeah, I would concur with what Ryland has said. There are different adjudicators who have differing views, and one doesn't always find that all adjudicators agree. One thing I do think is likely to happen is I think that the nature of the dispute is going to become far more complicated. I don't think it will be as simple as to whether the coronavirus is or is not a relevant event or a compensation event. I think arguments of estoppel will start to rise, and other arguments, because it is going to be such a major problem to a contractor that if they are not entitled to extensions of time, the amount of damages that could be levied will be substantial. So I think they're going to get into arguments that they worked under an assumption that the client assisted with and didn't say was wrong, that they would be awarded extensions of time, and other arguments will arise. I think the other factor is that adjudicators may be influenced by the level of damages that a party may be seeking. So if there is a very heavy and high liquidated damages clause stipulated in the contract, that may well influence the adjudicator in his decision.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. That seems to cover that one quite nicely. Henry, you have been doing some online seminars on contracts and COVID-19, and we've been asked, what do you believe will be the consequences on contracts post-COVID-19?
In terms of the actual works themselves, Julie?
Yeah, I believe that's what the
Okay.
is being asked.
Yeah, I think that there's a continuing duty. The one clear point that really comes to play, and we've been asked this question over repeatedly again, and a lot of the pragmatic questions again are repeated again and again. We're currently in an environment whereby, do sites close? Do they stay open? One particular question last week on one of the online seminars was from a CA about valuing the works, that they can't get to site, they can't value the works, what type of contemporaneous evidence, or how can they actually support what they actually say is going to be their value. What's very much, no matter what the circumstances are, there is a contract in place. There's been arguments to suggest, is this a frustrating event? It's not. If you're going to suggest that it's a frustrating event of the contract, the subject matter has to be destroyed. And I think that's one of the key instances, like whether or not we talk about it's a force majeure, it's a listed, unlisted, undefined mechanism. One of the key points is that the contents and the conditions of the contract still are in operation. So for example, if we talk about defects, or if we then split back, the contract is still in operation. So when we get to the very end, so if we're going to actually go through a period of time where we do go through suspension, there are defects, they will be treated in the same manner. The rights of set off, rights of abatement, rights of evaluation against the actual contract. So I think as well that if we're talking about defects post-PC, again, are they latent or patent defects? What really becomes particular in this case is whether or not the employer can actually check or actually inspect the works. Again, there will be nothing to sever these parts of the contract. So therefore, let's say, for example, a party cannot view because of their own policies for their own company, but work still continue on a particular site. The same rules will prevail. So the general rule for a lot of local authorities or a lot of building inspectors is that you don't cover something up until it's inspected. I think that's still true. I think as well, though, that there is exercise positions. So therefore, say if we talk under clause 3.12, the ability to open up works for inspection, and that will again take into account. So therefore, if the employer deems and issues an instruction to open up works, they're found not to be in accordance with the contract, any costs associated with the opening up or the rectification that will be borne by the contractor. So all of these different points will still come true. But as well as that, we're talking about the suspensions, and we're getting into an awful lot of agreements of what those type of agreements actually look like at the moment as we go into a period of suspension. I think it's worthwhile also to talk. Most of the clients I've been talking to in the last 2 weeks have been discussing that at the very least, there has been discussions with an employing party. And how those agreements look towards, it's the foreseeability in terms of what type of costs. Relevant matters won't come into play, even if we are successful in force majeure. And there's no suggestion in terms, we'd have to go through, there will be disputes in the future, there will be points of whether or not it is a force majeure, what the actual term in JCT means like, and this is why for that, given the circumstances. But if we do look into agreements whereby we would adopt the position and we take into a position of time, but maybe not costs, but if we do go into a suspension, do we now invoke a clause like 8.11 in the JCT? The period, and again, you have to look towards the particulars where there is a default period of 2 months. And given that passes, then we're into now positions where maybe we might actually think of terminating at that point. But during that period of suspension, what type of things are we looking towards? And I think John will probably certainly assist on this point when he comes to talk about insurances a little bit. But I do think that like in a position talking to insurance brokers, if there's car policies, if there's all of these different non-neg, that certainly the insurer is notified. If we do agree that we're going to accept time, any type of agreements that we'd look at now, certainly with liquidate damages or any of those different points, but as well as that, there will be ongoing maintenance, there will be costs of insuring, there will be costs of maintenance, all of those ancillary costs coming through as well. I'd actually say to a lot of contractors who would be thinking, there is a cost in terms of mobilization as well. So any of the agreements that we've been forming in the last number of days, they've actually looked towards how do we step it down? If we even get an instruction to remobilize on these, well, what do we do? Can we actually depend on our own supply chains, on our own subcontractors? How do we actually take those agreements that we're making now with an employer and actually step down those agreements as well to the supply chain to make sure there's an alignment going forward?
Okay, thanks for that, Henry. That's really useful. John, as Henry referenced, I know you've again done a series of online seminars on insurance and COVID-19. And views isn't necessarily great in terms of cover for COVID. But would you say that in terms of potential claims, costs, expenses, records, everything should be being kept at the moment? What's the best advice? Is what I'm being asked.
The best advice is to maintain records of everything at the moment, all expenses incurred. And also the best advice is to notify your insurers as soon as possible of any potential claims. Insurers' attitude at the moment is that there is no cover for for COVID-19 incidents. However, that may well change. I believe there will be government pressure applied. And one or two insurers are already moving towards some form of coverage. But you're still going to have to prove your loss. So therefore, you do need to keep all of your records, details of all the expenses that you've incurred. However, I have to say, at the moment, the majority of the insurance market is simply saying there is no cover for COVID-19. And there certainly won't be any cover after probably January of this year, because the policy wordings will have changed and specific clauses will have been put in to exclude COVID-19 in its entirety. If you have a policy, a bit like Ryland's point earlier, that was signed mid-January, then you may well have some claims going forward. But after that, very unlikely. But yes, keeping records, I'm quite sure insurers' position will be challenged in the courts in due course, and they may well be successful. If they are, if you haven't got the records, then you're still not going to be able to make your claim and extract money from insurers.
Okay. We've got a question here, which is probably one for either Henry, Ryland or Richard to answer. What happens if the contractor has concurrently suspended works for non-payment and COVID-19?
Okay, shall I jump in?
Yep.
I think the question will be one of dominant delay. Which one impacted the programme first? If it can be shown that the contractor has issued the 7-day notice, having not been paid the amount of money is due, and that he has suspended the works before there was a need to suspend the works by reason of the coronavirus, that is the dominant delay and would continue to be the dominant delay until the payment is made. Once the payment is made, it's no longer a delaying event, and hence the coronavirus would instead be the critical delay. So I think it's all a matter of timing and which one impacts upon the programme first.
Okay, has anyone got anything to add to that? No? Okay. Just one more thing. You mentioned this in your seminars, John, but we're going to ask the question again. Financial Ombudsman, FCA, what can you do with these guys?
He's on mute.
Yeah, I just sorry. Start again.
Sorry. It is an interesting area, this, and it's one that shouldn't be forgotten. All insurance companies are regulated by the FCA, and whilst the FCA rules are complex and not necessarily the easiest to understand, they do impose some duties on all FCA regulated companies, bank, insurance companies, etc., to treat their customers fairly. And there are other duties as well. Now, policy wordings are not the easiest documents to read and to understand. And there may be some arguments that are put to the FCA to say we were not treated fairly by insurers. We assumed we were covered for this type of event. Notifiable diseases was in our policy wording, and it can't be right that insurers can just now turn around and say you're not covered for that. Now, insurers' argument against that is that after the potential SARS pandemic in 2003-2005, they improved their wordings, and identifiable diseases that the policy responds to are either listed or it just says notifiable diseases. If it just says notifiable diseases, insurers say, well, we didn't know anything about COVID-19 pre-mid-January. We didn't charge you any premium for it. It was beyond the reasonable contemplation of any parties. We're not paying. But I can see there being complaints to the FCA about this, and I can see there being lots of complaints to the Financial Ombudsman Service, who have already said they've seen an increase in the number of complaints resulting from insurers' declination of all claims under the COVID-19 situation.
Okay, thanks, John. That's the last of the questions from our audience currently, unless anyone's got a last minute one they want to type into me. Gentlemen of our panel, are there any last minute tips you think you could share with our audience this afternoon, things they should remember?
I suppose the one I would just Julie, is travel insurance. I know it affects us all in terms of both business and personal travel, but please remember, do not voluntarily do anything. Do not cancel your holiday until the government's advice is do not travel to that particular country. Okay, do not cancel anything voluntarily because insurers will not pay you.
Okay, so that's do not cancel anything. That's loud and clear. Thank you, John.
Loud and clear message.
Okay.
I would say with regards to construction sites, what we must recognise that money is going to become difficult. There are substantial losses being incurred, be it because the building will be completed much later, or because you're going to need to bring labour back. It's going to be more difficult to obtain that labour. It's going to mean further delays and more problems. As with any claims, it is all down to records. So, photographic record, every form of record you need to keep it, but do be aware there are likely to be more claims going forward. What I would also suggest is it is always best to be early. Get in your claims as soon as possible and take the necessary action as soon as possible to get that money in. The longer you leave it, unfortunately, the less likely you will recover it. And I do anticipate there being more claims. As I've said, I've already been getting more nominations from the adjudicator, which is reflective of parties recognising the need to get money in as soon as possible. And I have no doubt that while staff are off, many people are looking through old final accounts, old retentions being held, and are seeking to recover those through the adjudicator.
Okay, thank you. Ryland Henry, have you got anything to add, Michael?
Yeah, just say one thing, sort of reiterating something I touched on earlier. It's really important to talk. Landlords and their agents are also human. They understand the predicament tenants are in. So if you know that you are not going to be able to pay your current quarter's rent, either in full or in part, speak to the landlord. Most of them should be prepared to do a deal. Likewise, if you are a landlord and you have not heard from your tenant, my advice would be contact your tenants, because I think a lot of people, if they owe money, think that they can bury their head in the sand. And if they actually see a decent, humane approach from a landlord, it's worthwhile. So my advice is it's good to talk.
Okay, that's great. I've just had two last minute questions come in. One is for you, John. Can John advise on claiming deposit refunds to secure a venue for party under this COVID-19?
Are you sure that one's for me, Julie?
It says, can John advise?
What was the question again?
Can John advise on claiming a deposit refund to secure a venue for a party under this COVID-19? Whoever Galaxy Tab A is, if you have any more details, just type them to me. The other one is an NEC question. John, we'll wait for some more details for yours.
No, hang on. No, I can probably deal with it. It will very much depend on the terms and conditions of the venue.
Right.
I've undoubtedly signed some at the time. It will depend. Normally, most venues have a list of the circumstances in which they return a deposit. But again, if you have cancelled, it may be different to a situation where the venue has cancelled.
Okay.
Clearly, you would need to look at the terms and conditions on your booking form, and undoubtedly in there will be some mention of return deposits, etc.
Okay.
So, as far as I could help, I need to see the terms and conditions, I suspect.
I think it's always to do with the terms and conditions that John quite rightly said, but this is becoming a far wider problem, particularly with regards to flights, by way of example. As John has said quite rightly, do not cancel, wait for the airline or the organisation to cancel, and then they've failed to provide what you've paid for. and therefore, depending on the terms of contract, dictates what you get. Now, my understanding to do with flights is they're obliged to give you money back, but I am aware that KLM and others are not willing to give money back at the moment. You can phone them up as much as you like and their calls, and they are proposing to give you credit notes. The position is you should not accept those and maintain you want your money back.
Okay, there'll be lots of people making calls.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the shining example, to be fair to them, is EasyJet. They cancelled the flight. They offered you an immediate refund.
That's good. Thank you. There's one more question. Henry Ryland, NEC 60.119 makes reference to an event which stops the contractor completing the works. Can this be interpreted as stopping the works entirely or just stopping a select few activities?
Yeah, Ryland, do you want to take it?
Yeah, happily. It's not express in terms of whether or not that means stopping everything or parts of it. An event which is an event that's covered by 60.119 could be something that leads to a delay, but it's a question of whether or not that delay affects either a key date or the completion date. So I don't think it's necessary that it stops everything. It could be an event that stops part of the works. It would still be a compensation event, and you'd then have to demonstrate that the event itself impacted upon the critical path in the program and that it impacted upon the key date or the completion date as a result.
Yeah, and I think I'll sort of assist on with that as well, because I think with NEC, of course, you have risks and you have risk elements under 80.1 as well. So those who are getting into contract with NEC, you certainly have the points of, especially NEC 4, you can actually add in compensation events. No doubt those compensation events now will start looking towards sort of pandemics, etc., for additional compensation events as well. But the importance of risk under NEC, certainly 80.1, and even like there was a question previously about under JCT, under a relevant event or relevant matter, even if we couldn't kick in for, say, the force majeure, if that doesn't bite in, what's the effect of any impediment, prevention or default? Could that actually mobilize into such an event? Truthfully, no, actually, I would suggest, because if you look at the whole wording of the clause, it's actually the default of the employer or any of the employer's person. So that's very specific, it's narrow, and it doesn't talk about external events. So that's actually coined in for a breach against that the employer has taken, which gives redress under the contract instead of common law. But I do think that those certain points would come into play.
I think,
okay.
Sorry, Julie, if I can say, we're very much concentrated on whether the coronavirus is or is not a relevant event or a compensation event. I think it is important to stress, and which has been referred to before, the need to prove the delay. Now, under NEC, we have very clear provisions that set down the requirement for the issuing of notices, quotations, and programs. But the JCT doesn't do that. Now, what I would suggest is if you are on the JCT contract, you should, once you know the works can recommence, is to issue a revised program, identifying clearly where the works are and how many weeks behind you are, with full and proper particulars, and taking photographs. Because what I can see is it's not going to be so simple that on day one you will get a full set of labour and everything starts as usual. You're going to need to do a lot of different things before the works progress properly. And in order to show what is the true delay to the works, it will all be down to your records. So I would have full details of what resources you have on site, what they're doing. I would be taking detailed photographs. I would be setting down a new program as my baseline and issuing new progress reports against those programs regularly and diligently to show what the effect is, and updating my notices regularly.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to our panel of Richard, Ryland, Henry, John and Michael. We aim to do these every couple of weeks. So if there's any updates to government advice or any further developments, we can update everybody. This record is being recorded and it will be available on the website along with the the contact details to everyone on the panel here, should you wish to contact them with a specific inquiry or more advice. So thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen, I'll send you around
open then, so I must have
I will send you around an update, just all the comments from the panel which are coming in thick and fast there. Everyone, you know, seems to be very happy. And I'll also let you know as soon as the recording is up online, along with your contact details. So if anyone's got any queries, then you can let me know. Other than that, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.